All night long, the female prisoners heard the groans and screams. They didn't know what was happening to the other women, but they knew they likely wouldn't see them again. Every day they put up with the sadistic guards and malicious nurses, and then, once the doctors got another idea in their heads, off the prisoners disappeared one by one, like bleeding lambs to the bloody slaughter. We're talking about Ravensbrück concentration camp, a place you'll become acquainted with in the video today, a place you'll never forget. It was just one camp of 23 main concentration camps. Each of these had sub-camps, but it's Ravensbrück where we'll spend most of our time today. Between 1942 and 1945, the Nazis conducted a myriad of medical experiments on the thousands of inmates at various concentration camps. Even though millions of people died in the gas chambers at these camps, and many more were worked to death or starved to death, the experiments with humans elicited a particular revulsion for the citizens of the world when they became known at the doctor's trial and the other trials after the war. This is how we got the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles aimed at preventing unethical medical practices. We'll talk more about the trials later. Right now, we want to show you a letter written on June 23, 1942, by SS Oberfuhrer Viktor Brack. Brack was one of the main people behind the Nazi euthanasia program, Aktion T4, in which as many as 300,000 people were euthanized, mostly because the Nazis deemed them mentally or physically sick beyond help. They called these mass murders mercy deaths. These physically disabled or mentally unwell people were deemed defective and a burden to society. In 1939, Adolf Hitler signed a top-secret authorization that would protect all physicians and medical staff taking part in the slaughter. You'll hear about the victims of this mass genocide later in the show. In 1942, Brack sent that letter. It was addressed to the bespectacled architect of the Holocaust, Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler. Himmler worked toward what was called the final solution to the Jewish question. Millions of Jews would be executed, worked to death, and experimented on. Brack wrote, "According to my impression, there are at least 2 to 3 million men and women well fit for work among the approximately 10 million European Jews. In consideration of the exceptional difficulties posed for us by the question of labor, I am of the opinion that these 2 to 3 million should in any case be taken out and kept alive." He added that they should not be allowed to procreate, and he suggested brutal methods of sterilization. The murder and experimentation also extended to Romani people, Soviet POWs, POWs from other nations, Polish political prisoners, ethnic minorities, and many more people the Nazis believed were expendable or dangerous to their idea of the Aryan race. The ones kept alive were considered useful. The Nazis were engaged in a world war, dying in the many thousands, millions by the end of the war. German soldiers froze in the waters when their ships sank. Men lost limbs on the battlefield and required ad hoc surgery to save their lives. Pilots passed out due to a lack of oxygen. Soldiers died from disease and infections. Some needed bone and muscle transplants when anesthesia wasn't available. Some were poisoned by chemicals, and others suffered burns all over their bodies from bombs. The Nazis wanted to recreate these situations in the camps and see what they could do to save German lives. The camps gave the Nazis the opportunity to conduct medical experiments which they believed would advance healthcare and surgery for their men on the front lines. They had more than guinea pigs, rats, and rabbits. They had the perfect specimen in their hands, humans, whose lives didn't mean anything to them. Having human test subjects was highly unethical, but it was also very useful. One experiment was titled Warming Up After Freezing to the Danger Point. The doctor, Sigmund Rascher, froze people close to death and then tried various methods of heating them up. The methods could then be used on German soldiers suffering from hypothermia. Rascher wrote after his experiment, Subject 11:57:63, naked, time of death 64 minutes, Subject 11:53:06, clothed, time of death 102 minutes. In another report he wrote, these cases ended fatally without any successful results from resuscitation efforts. At least 8 women from the Ravensbrück camp were used in what the Nazis called animal warmth experiments, in which the method of heating up the freezing body was sexual intercourse. Rascher was also behind the altitude experiments, in which he put prisoners, mostly Poles and Russians, in a chamber where he changed the air pressure to mimic what it would be like for a German pilot to parachute from high up without oxygen. He wrote, only continuous experiments at altitudes higher than 10.5 kilometers resulted in death. These experiments showed that breathing stopped after about 30 minutes. During the trials, it was later explained, under low-pressure conditions, disturbed behaviors were observed. Prisoners would tear out their hair, scratch their faces with their nails, beat their heads against the wall, or howl until they became unconscious. Even if they survived, cerebral hemorrhage often resulted in mental issues. In the blood coagulation experiments, the Nazis wanted to see how effective their new medicine was, which they thought would help blood coagulate after someone had been injured on the battlefield. Prisoners were shot in the neck or the chest after being given a tablet called Polygol 10. It was also given to prisoners who'd had an amputation. It seems the drug worked. One letter states, as regard to the effectiveness of Polygol, one can say it was absolutely evident how little the tissues bled. But there were deaths, as this next document from the trials explains. Experiments on human beings were carried out and death followed as a natural result of the use of Polygol drugs. Over 2,000 prisoners, many of them Polish Roman Catholic priests, were infected with malaria. It said about 450 of them died, often due to the toxic effects of antipyrine and pyramidon, the medications they were given. Other prisoners were subjected to operations they didn't need, often without anesthesia. Their stomachs were cut open. They had operations on their gallbladder, thyroid, lungs, appendix, kidney, urinary tract, and nervous system. Let's now concentrate only on Ravensbrück. One victim of such operations was a former Polish schoolteacher named Władysława Karolewska. She later testified what happened when she was picked out of a lineup, saying, "We were called at a time when usually executions took place, and I was going to be executed because before some girls were shot down. But she wasn't killed. She was taken to a room and given something that knocked her out. Dr. Fritz Ernst Fischer was in charge, working with Dr. Szydlowski and Dr. Rosenthal. You'll know about all of their fates at the end of the show." Karolewska woke up with bandages all over her leg, feeling extreme pain down there. She said the pain was increasing and the temperature too, and the next day I noticed that some liquid was flowing from my leg. In the next experiment, Dr. Fischer put a sheet over her head before operating on her, but she wasn't made unconscious. Many of the women in these experiments couldn't walk after a while. They were in pain 24/7, and yet they kept being sent back for more surgeries. The purpose of these experiments was later revealed to observe bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration and the possibility of bone and limb transplantation from one person to another. It's unclear just how many people died at Ravensbrück. One estimate is that there were 40,000 Polish prisoners and 26,000 Jewish prisoners, of which 28,000 died from overwork, starvation, beatings, and medical experiments. In total at the camp, there were something like 130,000 prisoners of various nationalities, of which about 50,000 died. And now we come to the main topic of the show, which is about the Nazis experimenting with infections. As you know, when it comes to battlefield injuries, infections are one of the deadliest things that can happen to a soldier, and that's why the Nazis deliberately infected prisoners at the camps. There is perhaps one man better known than any Nazi when it comes to this topic. His name was Karl Gebhardt, chief surgeon of the Third Reich and the man behind many of the medical atrocities that took place at the Ravensbrück and Auschwitz camps. He was responsible for many of those surgeries without anesthesia we just mentioned, for needless transplants, but also for the tests where so-called rabbits were exposed to substances that would result in infections. This was explained in testimonies after the war, of which one explained, "The criminal experiments consisted in the deliberate cutting out and infection of bones and muscles of the legs with virulent bacteria, the cutting out of nerves, the introducing into the tissues of virulent substances, and the causing of artificial bone fractures." Some of the experiments featured what is known as sulfa drugs, sometimes called sulfonamides. This is a range of medicines used to treat bacterial infections. There's a story about why these drugs were first used. After a high-ranking SS officer named Reinhard Heydrich was severely injured in a car bombing in 1942, Adolf Hitler was very upset. The two men were good friends, and Hitler was appalled when he heard about Heydrich's very serious injuries, including facial injuries from shrapnel and damage to his lungs and spleen. He got sepsis and died, which infuriated Hitler even more. Himmler's personal physician at the time was a Gebhardt, who, it said, refused to treat Heydrich with those sulfa drugs. Hitler put the blame on Gebhardt, to which Gebhardt said the drugs wouldn't have saved Heydrich. He wanted to prove that point, so one way he could do that was to use it on those Polish prisoners the Nazis held in the camps. These were not injured women, but the healthiest specimens they could find. He injured them and in turn tried to fix them up. Gebhardt first tried this on male prisoners at Sachsenhausen camp, about an hour's drive from Ravensbrück, but the men were said to be difficult to control. It was Fischer that conducted those experiments, but under the orders of Gebhardt. In Fischer's affidavit at the trial, he explained the process, saying, "An incision was made 5 to 8 centimeters in length and 1 to 1.5 centimeters in depth on the outside of the lower leg in the area of the peroneus longus. The bacterial cultures were put into dextrose and the resulting mixture was spread into the wound. The wound was then closed. No serious illnesses resulted. So not only were the males a handful, but the doctors hadn't succeeded in causing infections in the wounds. We found out at the Nuremberg trials that the doctors then chose about 60 Polish women for further experiments. The idea was simple: cut open the body and apply bacterial cultures. The records show the doctors even put glass in the wounds. After that, they sewed the wound closed and hoped for the best, which was a full-on infection. Also applied to the wounds were cloth fibers, wood shavings, and dirt. The fragments of glass were to simulate the crust of dirt customarily found in battlefield wounds and to accelerate the process of infection. The bacterial cultures were a mix of Staphylococci, Streptococci, Clostridium perfringens, and Clostridium novii. These were known to cause deadly gangrene or tetanus. The women were in terrible pain, not knowing what the doctors had done to them. Many became very ill, coming down with severe fevers. They were in the midst of an infection. That's when the doctors treated some of them with sulfonylamides and left other women without any medications. Gebhardt was likely very pleased and felt vindicated after what Hitler had said to him. The women who were treated with the drugs didn't show any signs of getting healthier. Their infections continued to ravage their bodies. SS Chief Medical Officer Professor Ernst Robert Grawitz, the man who had once promised to eradicate the perverted world of the homosexual, also watched over some of those experiments. As these women were suffering, he looked at them and called the experiments a waste of time. He said they couldn't have properly replicated what happens in the battlefield, otherwise the women would be dead by now. The doctors then used the same women for the same experiment. Some of them went through this 8 times. Barbara Piecyk was operated on 5 times in 1942, which left her with left lower limb paralysis. She was just 16, making her the junior of all the rabbits. She survived her ordeal but died due to complications of the experiments in 1947. Some of the women who survived later said the Nazis would just execute women they no longer felt served a purpose. These women were very close. A historian later wrote that when they knew one of them was up for execution, they'd fix the victim's hair and spoil them as much as possible. The historian explained they would pinch their cheeks for color, do their hair, do the best they could to make themselves beautiful for that last walk. It was Grawitz who decided that if they were going to infect the women just like what had happened on the battlefield, they needed to shoot them and then try using sulfa drugs. One of the testimonies later explained, "The normal result of all bullet wounds was a shattering of tissue which did not exist in the initial experiments. As a result of the injury, the normal flow of blood through the muscle is cut off. The muscle is nourished by the flow of blood from either end. When this circulation is interrupted, the affected area becomes a fertile field for the growth of bacteria. The normal reaction of the tissue against the bacteria is not possible without circulation." Gebhardt took 24 Polish female prisoners and tied their muscles off to prevent the circulation of blood. This led to necrosis, the death of the tissue. After this, the doctors introduced bacteria to the wound. 5 women died from serious infections, which the doctors saw as a great success. This was a much better way to ensure the parts of the victim's body got infected compared to the other experiments. Some of these women were given sulfonilamide powder, which was rubbed into their wounds. Others received sulfonilamide powder to be taken orally, and some were told to take the sulfonilamide tablets. To cover all their bases, the doctors gave some of the women sulfonilamide injections on top of the other treatments, while some women were left to die or cling to life without any treatment at all. Many of the rabbits became seriously ill, especially after they developed abscesses and life-threatening systemic infections. We might recall the woman we spoke about earlier who would see the doctor and later wake up in pain. A paper in the National Institutes of Health states post-operative care of the women was entirely inadequate. Many of them were not given any analgesics, and the wound dressings were changed inconsistently, if at all. As we told you, some were shot. This was to stop them from ever talking about what had happened to them. The Nazis knew what they were doing was highly unethical, but some did survive, and they testified. 4 of them were Maria Broel-Platter, Jadwiga Zido, Władysława Karlewska, and Maria Kuśmierczuk. They all testified during the doctor's trial. Prisoner Dr. Sofia Maszka also testified, saying that many of those women could have easily been saved if the Nazis had amputated the infected area. Gebhardt was later asked why he had not done this. Why not save them? He replied, "As I remember the case histories, the most serious patient had a large abscess on the hip. Probably the corresponding glands had been affected. The infection on the calf and the abscess on the hip, what can I amputate? One can amputate when the infection is limited to the calf. It's believed he knew very well that sulfa drugs would not help with the gangrene. The Americans and the British doctors he knew had tried and failed in the past to use sulfa drugs. The long and short of it is that the women were expendable, just like animals that were routinely used all over the world for various medical experiments. Even worse is the fact that even if some of the women did survive the gangrene experiments, they were then used for experiments relating to bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. The Nazis tried to transplant bones and even limbs from one woman to another. Some experiments included harvesting a part of a person's tibia or fibula, the bones of the bottom of your leg, and transplanting them to another woman's leg. The doctors didn't care that such an operation had a high risk of resulting in sepsis. This was just insane, since the doctors were already aware of such operations. They knew they could work. There wasn't any pressing need to do this to the women. In her affidavit, a Czech doctor named Dr. Zdenka Nedvědova-Niedla, who worked in the camp, explained what went down. She said, high amputations were performed. For example, even whole arms with shoulder blade or legs were amputated. These operations were performed mostly on insane women who were immediately killed after the operation by a quick ejection of Evipan. She added, they lay without any assistance, and it was not permitted to administer sedatives even against the most intensive post-operational pains. 11 women died as a result of these experiments. We think you need to hear some testimonies from other women. Here are a few short excerpts taken from longer transcripts. I saw the hangman, Dr. Rosenthal, coming toward me. From the corridor where I was lying on the stretcher, I looked through the window at the sky and thought I was looking at it for the last time. I was given an intravenous injection. I don't remember what happened afterward. When I awoke, I felt very bad pain in both legs, and the whole of my body seemed to be paralyzed. This was what another woman said. The screams never ceased from the chamber of torture. The girls were not given any painkillers so that the course of the experiment would not be impaired in any way. Dogs that had undergone the same experiment received strong doses of morphine for 5 days. After a few days, the first pole, a girl of 17, died. Her leg was huge, swollen, monstrous, blue with red wounds, and the stench emanated from them was nauseating. In one of the most shocking pieces of testimony, it was explained, in order to carry out better and more detailed research, they removed some women's entire hips, shoulder joints, or whole upper extremity along with the shoulder blade. Then the professor or his assistants, also physicians from Hohenleichen, like Gravitz, Kogel, and Schultz, wrapped these in sheets and carried them to their car. Naturally, the women thus operated on were immediately after the surgery killed by an injection. Gebhardt was one of 23 men at the doctor's trial that took place from December 9, 1946 to August 20, 1947. This was a series of 12 trials during which 7 men were sentenced to death, 7 were acquitted, and the rest received a 10-year to life prison sentence. Gebhardt was hanged on June 2, 1948. Fischer was imprisoned and released in 1954, after which he had a successful career working for a chemical company. He died aged 90 in 2003. Victor Braque was also hanged in 1948, still saying that what he'd done to those people was a humane measure. Before he swung from the rope, he wished peace to the world. When Ernst Robert Gravitz knew the Red Army was about to get hold of him, he did as many Nazis did and made sure both him and his family would not have to face the consequences of his heinous actions. After gathering his family in their home, he detonated a grenade, killing everyone inside. Other doctors involved in these bacteria and transplant experiments at Ravensbrück concentration camp were Dr. Hertha Oberhauser, who was out of prison in just 4 years, Dr. Rolf Rosenthal, and Gerhard Scheidlowski, who were tried by the Brits at the Hamburg Ravensbrück trials and died at the end of a rope in May 1947. In this trial, 21 of the accused perpetrators were women. This was unusual. Many of these women weren't directly involved in the experiments. They were merely guards or nurses, so how much pain and murder they should be responsible for is questionable. A prisoner named Helena Esther Gaudschmidt later said, "The nurses were hardly any better than the doctors." In her testimony, she said, "The German nurses never had any professional activity. They looked on the misery of the sick with the greatest indifference and even sarcasm, and never made any effort whatsoever to help them, even though it was possible for them to do so." There were usually 6 nurses at the Ravensbrück camp, and also 3 female doctors. They were Hertha Oberhauser, Erika Johnson, and Gerda Viand. Johnson and Viand did not stand trial, and you know what happened to Oberhauser, just 4 years in prison. Women nurses were not let off easy, though, not if they'd been heavily involved in the torment and murder. Vera Salvikart, a nurse who'd inspected Jewish corpses for gold teeth, was also hanged in England. This was perhaps surprising, given the fact that she'd been in a German camp herself during the war for having a relationship with a Jewish man and subsequently refusing to give him up to the Gestapo. On another occasion, she helped 5 detained officers escape from certain death at a camp. In her testimony, she said she saved women and children from death by switching their identification numbers for dead people's IDs, but the Brits executed her even though it turned out she'd spied for them at one point during the war. Greta Bossel, Ravensbrück camp work input overseer and also a nurse, was hanged. She was accused of leading prisoners out of Ravensbrück on a death march, as well as selecting prisoners for the gas chamber at Uckermark camp. She was executed just 24 minutes after Elizabeth Marshall, the head nurse at Ravensbrück, who it was said oversaw many experiments and selected women for execution. The most feared female was said to be Dorothea Binns, a guard at Ravensbrück. Prisoners said she would look out for the weakest women and then, with no provocation, just whip, stomp, and beat them. It was said she'd walk around the camp with her whip and German Shepherd looking for someone to beat. She had a boyfriend guard in the camp, and together they'd stroll among the many horrors of the camp, watching the violence with glee. The British hanged her on May 2, 1947. Another guard, Carmen Mori, who was described as sadomasochistic, psychopathic, sexually voracious, and one of the camp's most notorious capos, would have been hanged had she not died shortly before her execution date. She actually worked as a spy for the Allies and was sentenced to death by the Nazis at an earlier date, but got off after someone put in a good word for her. Emma Zimmer was another sadist at Ravensbrück who it said took great pleasure in telling women, "I will report you and then you will go away. You know where? Just one way up the chimney." She was hanged on September 20, 1948, along with Ida Schreider, who had selected women for execution at the camp. 17 people were hanged in total after the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials, and 2 died during the trial, while just 1 was reprieved. Now you need to watch Sewing Twins, Nazi Camp Experiments, or have a look at the dark, true story of Adolf Hitler.